Hello and welcome to Senior Moment. My name is David Reffsin. I am your host for the show. Senior Moment is for seniors and about seniors. I am pleased to have as my guest today Susanne Dunlap to my show. Susanne is a concert pianist, novelist, teacher, among others. And Susanne, welcome and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
So let's talk a little bit about you and how things got started early on. That's okay. How things got started early on in your life and how you moved to be a concert pianist. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I could never lay claim to actually being a concert pianist.
Okay.
I was a very serious pianist, and I studied for most of my life, and I went away from it to write advertising copy and then came back to it to go to graduate school at Smith in the late 80s. And piano was just something that I always did when I was young. It was my sort of refuge, and I loved music. And when I was 3, I think, I had a picture book called Mozart the Wonder Boy. And when people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would say I wanted to be Mozart. So I never quite achieved that, to be honest.
But you obviously played in concerts.
Well, yes, I performed. I did recitals. I did a concerto with the Smith Orchestra when I was a senior. And I left and moved to London. I had done my junior year at the Royal College of Music, and I moved to London to study with a wonderful teacher, Peter Valfish. And, it becomes pretty clear after a while that making any kind of a living as a performer is really, really difficult.
Sure.
And I just decided to explore other options, kind of fell into a career in writing advertising copy. I was always a writer of some sort or another. And so music has been in the background a lot of my life. I continued to play the piano, but I haven't played for a long time.
You play for yourself, though?
No. I do not touch the piano now.
Oh, okay.
And the reason for that, as anybody who's a very, very proficient musician who's given it up knows, is somehow, especially piano, is like being an elite athlete. You have the muscles, the muscle memory, the physical capability, and once you lose that, it's a lot of work to get it back.
Okay.
And it's also very frustrating to sit down at the piano and expect your hands to be able to do something they can't. So I've swerved into my creative efforts being in writing rather than music.
So you did decide, though, to get a PhD in music history.
Yes.
Now, was that in connection to the fact that you did play piano for a while, but having a love for music at the same time? Is that where it came from?
Yes, it did, very much so. I had done a master's, an MA in musicology at Smith, and that's when I really seriously played the piano again. And I got to the end of that, and I kind of had a decision to make whether I wanted to continue with the performing side or go into the academic side. And I got into the artist diploma program at Hart, and I also got into the PhD program at Yale. And after a lot of soul searching, I thought, well, I think the academic route is probably more practical. And so that's what I did. And
this was at Yale.
At Yale.
Yeah.
And just once you're doing something like that, plus I had teenage children, plus all of that, it's really hard to keep up the level of practice. I mean, when I was in graduate school at Smith, I was practicing 4 hours a day or there, and you really can't do that when you're doing all the work, plus commuting from Northampton to New Haven to do your PhD. So
once you got that, did you teach at all? Was that part of the equation?
I did. I taught while I was doing the degree, and I got one amazing teaching gig as a visiting assistant professor at Columbia.
Wow.
Which was fabulous. I really loved it, and it was really sort of what I wanted to do with my life at that point. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I was an older student to begin with. I had teenage children in school in Northampton. Was around the time when the humanities were being kind of shortchanged at colleges and universities. And I discovered that when I was applying for jobs within commuting distance of Northampton, say, I was up against 120 other qualified applicants. And you know, it was, the jobs just weren't there. And I also wasn't in a position in my life to sort of take off and work at a college in the Midwest at a starting salary. So I was like, oh gosh, I just spent 11 years in graduate school, and now what am I going to do?
Right, I gotcha. Well, at some point, and you mentioned this just before, you did writings in various iterations before, and eventually that led you to start thinking about writing as more of a career, correct?
Well, interestingly enough, I did have a career as a copywriter in advertising, which is nothing at all to do with this kind of writing. But I wrote academic work when I was doing my PhD. Go back a little bit to when I first lived in London, when I sort of gave up trying to be a pianist then. And I got very, very interested in literature and in the Bloomsbury group and all that sort of thing. And I started doing some writing then, which, thank heavens, has completely disappeared from the world. Because I really had no clue, you know. And then when I couldn't get a job, and I had, one of the things I loved about music history were all the stories. I mean, the stuff that you find. And I was also very interested in it in a feminist way. And, you know, even though I technically studied dead white European males, the interface between the musical establishment and what was expected of women as performers, as creators, of which there were not that many in the periods I was talking about, which was sort of 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, although they increased a bit in the 19th century. I just had all these ideas, which at first I thought would be academic papers. And then, you know, research led me to thinking about just putting myself in that place and in the world in which these women had to live and thrive.
I know that a lot of your work is in the area of historical fiction. And for people who don't quite know, me to some small extent, tell me what historical fiction really is.
Sure. Well, actually, all of my work is historical
fiction.
I
understand that.
But historical fiction is anything that is set in a time that is not the present or within living memory. And there's a lot of different sort of subgenres of historical fiction, but those are more for marketing than anything else. But it's a time, for instance, Tolstoy's War and Peace is historical fiction because he wrote it later in the century about an earlier time, but Anna Karenina is not, because that was a contemporary to him. And there's historical romance, which is basically a romance set in a different period, and a lot of those authors do a lot of research to really get the period settings right. There's biographical historical fiction. There are historical mysteries. I have a combination in my work of real historical figures and people I create, characters I create, who interact with those figures and the time.
Okay. So you mentioned 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So let's just take 17th for the moment. So you looked at folks in that period and decided that this is a good time frame for you, and you started researching characters within that realm, and then it expands to writing.
Well, 17th century is interesting because that was my first published historical novel, Emily's Voice. And that came directly from the work I was doing in early opera. The whole idea of a woman, that women as performers were sort of allowed to do certain things. They could play the keyboard, they could sing. They were not allowed to do things that were considered unfeminine, like even playing the violin was kind of, I mean, Leopold Mozart wouldn't let his daughter, even though she was a brilliant violinist, frowned on her playing the violin, even though that's what she really wanted to do. So she always had to accompany Mozart, who was the violinist, you know. But that first novel grew out of my research and exploration of the power of the female voice and how men especially wanted to control it and own it. And so I invented this character, Emily, who had a beautiful, beautiful voice, who's discovered by a real-life composer about whom not a whole lot is known. His name was Marc-Antoine Charpentier. And Lully was the court composer in the court of Louis XIV. And Lully and Charpentier kind of had a rivalry. And so Charpentier discovers this beautiful voice, and soon enough, Lully is trying to get her to come to court. And that's the whole, you know, the sort of tussle over that voice and what happens to her as a real person and what she has to go through is sort of the foundation of that book.
I think you may have kind of summed it up to some extent, but I just want to go back to the idea that you've chosen historical fiction versus modern-day characters who are still either alive or whatever. What kind of brought you to that realm? I mean, you've sort of answered it to some extent.
I love history, first of all,
right.
and I loved the history of music, which really brought me into it. And there's something for me about losing myself in an earlier period, about really trying to understand what it was like then, really sort of asking myself the questions of why were these, how did women live, especially women live when there were so many things they could not do and expectations put on them that are very different from what we have today. And, you know, it's tricky because there's sometimes a temptation in writing historical fiction to give those female characters the agency they didn't have and to put sort of 21st century ideas into their heads. Right. But it's a challenge not to do that. And to still give them a sense of reality, of having agency, and somehow finding a way to work within and break out of, as much as they can, the restrictions put on them.
So let me ask you this, and again, it's sort of in the same realm, sort of, but how do you go about choosing your characters? I mean, there's obviously a lot of women who you could have chosen as characters for your book or ideas about. How do you go about doing? Is it just part of your historical research and your involvement in music and other things? I mean, how do you go about that process?
That's a really good question because it's entirely mysterious to me.
Okay.
It can be anything. It can be just, ooh, this is an interesting person. Let me look into it and see what's there. Or it can be something I stumble across while I'm doing research. Or it can be very intentional. You know, my editor at Bloomsbury really wanted someone to write a YA historical novel that featured Florence Nightingale.
Okay.
And I thought about it, and Florence Nightingale, unfortunately, was, when she was doing her interesting stuff, a mature woman, not a heroine suitable for a young adult novel.
Right.
So I don't know. I created this character of a parlor maid who loses her job, a young parlor maid who loses her job and sees like the only way she's going to be able to send money home to her family or whatever is to stow away with Florence Nightingale and her nurses when they go to the Crimea.
Gotcha.
I don't know where she came from.
I hear you. Let me ask you this, and you just kind of brought it up. For those who don't know, YA is young adults. So why that? I know some of your work is for adults as well, but it sounds like maybe primarily it's towards young adults. Am I missing something?
Well,
there?
I started out with 2 adult novels, then I had 4 young adult novels, and now my most recent work is adult again.
Okay.
So, but young adult is more, to me, more of a marketing thing than the focus is maybe a little bit different, but I don't write any differently for adults and young adults. I mean, the story is the story, the craft is the craft. You have to do all the same things.
Sure.
I don't talk down, I mean, especially young adult. I mean, I was reading, I don't know about you, but I read Gone with the Wind in 7th grade,
Right.
So anyone who can read well is perfectly capable of reading it.
Sure.
It's just a question of appeal and of the characters feeling like they can identify with the characters.
Do you find the young adult population is interested in your books? I would think they would be.
Historical fiction for young adults is tricky.
Right.
Because what seems to be most successfully marketed to that age group is fantasy, right, or really gritty, realistic, contemporary teen stuff. And historical fiction, there are definitely people who are interested in it, but it's more if you can get something that kind of dovetails with the curriculum in schools or something like that. And I was interested, I mean, none of mine really, I'm not that interested in American subjects, for instance, or wasn't, and so I didn't write those. And my first novel a young adult novel, had a decent amount of success. And all of them, for instance, were taken by the Texas school system, which is the biggest school system in the country.
That's great.
But
you also brought up another sort of issue. You're dealing with subjects from the past with a young adult audience who's present in terms of social media and computers. So it's different. In other words, if they lived in the 1800s, that's one thing. But here they are in a totally different world in the 21st century, trying to get back to whatever that is, 17th, 18th century.
Interestingly enough, I find that as many adults as young adults actually read my young adult books. They're not, plenty of adults have read them and enjoyed them. And I'm not going to sort of become this person who is on a mission to shove history down the throats of teenagers. But, and that's part of the reason I think now that, that I'm more in control of my own publishing, that it's like, some people think that Listen to the Wind, that my trilogy could be for young adults because of the ages of the characters, because there's a sort of coming of age kind of thing. But I don't want to limit that. I don't want to label it young adult.
I agree.
And so I'm just putting it out as an adult.
But you also said part of it is a marketing situation.
Yes, it is. And that can be both helpful and limiting. And I think and a lot of those marketing categories are born of the fact that the publishing industry just doesn't know. They're just trying to figure out and how bookstores shelve things.
Sure, of course.
And literary fiction, which covers a huge, broad realm of subjects and everything, is it's not a genre.
Right. Susanne was kind enough to bring one of her books, Listen to the Wind, and I've asked her to read a passage from it, and she has kindly said she would. So I'm going to allow her to do that so you can get an idea of the kind of writing that Susanne does and something about this particular book in general. So please.
Well, just to set it up a tiny bit.
Sure, go ahead.
The two main characters are Azamar and Azalea. They're young, and very young at the beginning. She is, I guess, about 10 and he's 12 or thereabouts. And they've been sent away without knowing why from their family in 13th century Languedoc, which is southern France, which was not part of France. At this point that I'm going to read you, Azoulay has been, after a few years, has been living with a hermit who's attached to a monastery. And she's learned to read and write because he's going blind, and she's helping him with his, do his stuff. But there's this really kind of creepy Dominican monk who who figures in this.
Okay.
She's up at the monastery. It's Easter or Palm Sunday, I think, and she's helping the good guy, the good Cistercian monk, go up. The wind that day was fierce. It sent great puffs of clouds scudding across the sky and tore bits off them as they went. At first, the clouds were bright white, revealing intermittent patches of vibrant blue. Gradually, they darkened and piled up on each other to the point that the cloud cover varied between dark gray and lighter gray, with only an occasional slanting shaft of sunlight piercing through a momentary gap. Sorry. Frère Goncourt rested his left hand on Azoulay's shoulder and with his right hand used a long stick to help him over the stony ground that led to the chapel of the Abbaye, the abbey. The clang of bells now rose, now faded on the wind as they made the climb. In contrast to the joy with which Frère Goncourt greeted the beginning of this Holy Week, Azoulay's spirits were oppressed. She and Frère Goncourt had been speaking of the fact that she must leave his protection. Despite his bad eyesight, even he could detect that soon it would no longer be possible to disguise her sex from the insular world of the abbey and its ecclesiastical visitors. The interior of the chapel blazed with hundreds of long tapers, and the scent of spring flowers mingled with incense. Azoulay's apprehensions melted away in the presence of so much beauty and the devout men and boys whose eyes shone with religious fervor. She felt the magic of the Mass seep into her as it never had before, and sang out to God with abandon and joy. At the end of the service, Azoulay waited her turn to file out with the conversants, once the monks had left through the door that led into the cloisters. To her dismay, she saw the abbot take Frère Goncourt's arm and lead him off to where she could not follow. Doubtless he wished to discuss some theological matter, and Azoulay would have to wait alone outside until Frère Goncourt emerged so that she could help him down the hillside. The clouds had evened out to a thin, flat shield against the brilliant sun. Up here, where the trees were short and the light bounced off white boulders, even on days where the sun never showed its face, the glare could be blinding. Azoulay closed her eyes against the sudden brightness and sat on a rock near the path. All the lay brothers had filed off to the dormitory to rest on the Sabbath. They looked exhausted, Azoulay thought. It was planting season, and no one ceased his labors until every task was accomplished. Azoulay was so absorbed in her own thoughts that she did not hear Frère Martin approach. "You have grown much these past years." The monk's familiar and unwelcome voice startled Azoulay. She recovered her wits quickly. "So I am told." "We've had little opportunity to speak together alone. There are some things I would like to ask you," he said, placing his body so that Azoulay would have to push past him to walk away. "Do you know your catechism? Will you remain in the Anchor with your benefactor? Or might you join the devout here at the Abbey and spend your days in prayer and work on the land? Or perhaps one day you will become a Dominican like myself and help us spread the word of God to this benighted land." With each question, Frère Martin moved closer. Azoulay leaned back against the rocks. "We could use a strong, healthy lad like you to help us," the monk continued. "Frère Goncourt still needs me to read and write for him," Azoulay said. "His eyes are failing." All at once, the monk took a step toward Azoulay and grabbed her arm. "Perhaps that is why he does not see what a pretty boy you have become." Azoulay was not certain what Frère Martin planned to do to her, but she knew that if he touched her in one particular place, her secret would be discovered. As his hands began to explore down her arms and then her torso, she struggled against him. His touch nauseated her, and she twisted and fought to escape his hands, but he was surprisingly strong. Frère Martin stood very close to her, pressing himself up against her body. She could smell his breath, feel his heart beating fast, and his hands beginning to tremble. She knew she had to do something. Just before he reached the place between her legs where her lack of manhood would be all too obvious, Azalea closed her eyes, said a silent prayer for forgiveness, and brought her knee up sharply, landing a solid blow in his crotch. At first, Frère Martin simply froze. Then his face wrinkled into a mask of agony, and he doubled over, letting go of Azalea. For only a moment, her instincts to come to the aid of a creature in pain almost overcame her revulsion to the monk, and Azalea took a few steps toward the abbey to fetch Frère Goncourt. But then she realized that if she did that, she would have to explain how the Dominican happened to have been injured in such a way. She knew that not only would she be punished, probably beaten, if her deed became known, but that she would also very likely have to leave Frère Goncourt immediately. He would never want to harbor someone who was capable of harboring another soul.
We're going to have to sort of end at that
Okay.
moment. Before, we don't have much time left, but give me a minute or two of what the future holds for you. What are you looking to accomplish?
Well,
going
book
forward?
2 of this trilogy comes out on December 6th.
Okay.
And I'm also re-editing the sequel to my first YA novel, which was a mystery in 18th century Vienna. And for some reason, my editor at Bloomsbury wasn't interested in the sequel, but I have readers asking me for it all the time. So I'm doing that. I'm doing editing, other people's work, and ghostwriting, and I'll be teaching a couple of workshops at Writers in Progress in Florence. And I have another work in progress, a brand new book that I just started tinkering with. So
Sounds wonderful. Susanne Dunlap, thank you so much for being a guest on my show. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Amherst Media for allowing me to do my show and to produce it here. They are a wonderful group of people. So until next time, thank you again.